more on the trade frictions and what is beyond when it comes to China's development path, we are joined in our Beijing studio Victor Gao Zhikai, a current affairs commentator, also the chairman of China Energy Security Institute. Welcome, sir. And also joining us in Beijing, Hannah Ryder, who's the CEO of Development Reimagined, who's also China representative of China Africa Advisory. Welcome to our program, too. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Surya Gupta, who is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. Welcome to you, too, sir. Let me begin by asking you, Dr. Gao, about the latest development between Japan and the United States. We understand the bilateral trade discussions likely to take place at the ministerial level. And what do you make of the potential? It seems that both sides have different directions that want to persuade the other side to go. Dr. Gao.
Well, I personally believe it is a good development for the United States and Japan to restart their trade negotiations. We all remember very vividly that after President Donald Trump became the U.S. president, he actually walked away from the TPP, which was a major blow to Prime Minister Abe and Japan. And therefore, Japan actually has a lot of second guessing about what exactly the United States has in mind and how to deal with a very unpredictable U.S. president. So we need to give them more time to see how these two countries will reach agreement and how the agreement itself, or not, and how the agreement will be executed.
Yes. Mr. Gupta, what do you make of that potential? Any agreement walking toward the direction of TPP or things like that? Or it is very much different, a potential?
There's absolutely no potential for something like TPP or something which is like a plurilateral agreement. It will have to be, whatever negotiations happen, have to be something in a bilateral context. The Japanese are unhappy about that, to be sitting in a bilateral context, but understand that at the end of the day they just do have to sit across the table from Mr. Trump and his representatives. So they are hoping to come away with something on the lines of what Mr. Juncker came away with about 2 or 3 weeks back. Japan is in a strong position to make aggressive demands because its weak link, agriculture, is no longer such a weak link in international trade negotiations, so it can leverage those concessions in that area to make strong demands in the auto sector, which is an area where Mr. Trump is unable to match the Japanese requirements. So they can take aggressive positions, but my understanding of where Japan is going right now is just hoping that Mr. Trump will not make things any worse, particularly by imposing tariffs after a Section 232 investigation on auto imports.
Right. Mr. Gupta, if you briefly help us to understand further about the issue you just raised, which is the apparent verbal agreement, in a way, or consensus reached between the EU and the US side, which is not being followed up by actions because the EU economies have not necessarily agreed what with the president of the European Union said in Washington, for example, France. So therefore, is there anything left at all about that meeting and that photo op between Washington and Brussels?
We'll have to reserve judgment on that, I would say, for at least about a couple of weeks more. Here's the reason why. You know, the fundamental consensus that was reached between Mr. Trump and the EU Commission, ahead of the EU Commission, was that at this point of time nobody was going to make anything worse. They were going to suspend having any further tariffs. Now, if we remember back to mid-May, that was exactly the consensus that was reached by Mr. Steve Mnuchin and Vice Premier Liu He, and that was blessed by Mr. Trump in the Oval Office. Within a week, he tore that agreement apart. So at this point of time, what has been agreed, the consensus with the Euros, just about stands, even though the potential for any deepening of trade negotiations between the two parties, I would say, is frankly practically impossible. But if I could just say one thing, it's important to note that the NAFTA negotiations, the negotiations with Mexico, have a great deal of importance here, because Mexico runs a huge trade surplus with the US in auto parts and in autos, and that is primarily Japanese and German vehicles which are exported to the US market from Mexico.
Well,
and if those negotiations work well, then the need to really impose tariffs on German autos and Japanese autos might really not need to happen.
Well, all these pictures are actually quite intertwined with one another, but credibility is always one of the most important qualities when it comes to any negotiation in the world. Dr. Cao, your response to what could this bilateral talks eventually mean for the current chaotic situation of trade wars?
Well, when we talk about the discussion between EU and the United States, what agreed by Mr. Juncker and President Donald Trump, of course, Mr. Juncker wanted to do the best thing he could for EU. However, EU has a membership of about 27 countries, and each country has its own consideration. And I think President Macron of France said the right thing. Stop threatening tariffs on the automobile industry first. And then EU or countries like France and Germany will have better seriousness in talking to the United States. And I think this should be a lesson that President Donald Trump should learn, because unless he really stops threatening other countries, including, for example, countries like Germany, France and China, with imposing unilateral tariffs, no other country would take the United States very seriously. Therefore, these discussions are discussions for discussions purposes. Whether they can reach agreement, whether the agreement can be honored, no one knows.
Right, and people remember very clearly back in the 1970s when the Japanese were negotiating with the Americans, and what exactly Japan get at the end of the day, particularly after so many concessions. It is almost nothing. And therefore, people know there has to be some attitude that economies must take in order to have a stance in a negotiation. Having said that, though, this is all big backdrop, Ms. Ryder, when we are talking about China's development path. Obviously, one of the most important stories these days is the trade war. Secondly, it is about China's outreach to the rest of the world, to Africa, to Latin America, newly developing and emerging economies, for example. Therefore, Ms. Ryder, given the pressure of trade wars, given the suspicions some of those might have about China's development path, what do you make of China's ongoing efforts so far? For example, in Africa, where you just came back from.
Yes, well, I just came back from Rwanda, where the Chinese president was there just over a week ago.
That's right.
And where even the impact of the trade war and these challenges is being felt. The US, for example, has just imposed some restrictions on Rwanda because Rwanda is trying to take a stance itself in terms of trying to improve its textile and garment industry. And because of these sanctions from the US, one of the factories which I toured, they've just had to close down 500 jobs in order to now switch to try and find some new buyers in Europe so that they can address this situation and still continue to operate.
So what people were saying there when they knew that it was because of the United States that cut the inflow of the Rwandan textile products, that these 500 workers have to, you know, give up their job.
Yes, well, temporarily, hopefully. But the attitude is really, Rwanda just wants to stand strong. And I think that's the case with many other African countries. You see the African continent trying to make its own trying to make its own efforts to globalize, to have this free trade agreement across Africa. And of course, China has to be a very important partner for that. The factory floor I'm talking about is a Chinese investor. And actually with some of my partners from another organization, Made in Africa Initiative, we're trying to bring more and more Chinese investors into the continent, not just Rwanda, but elsewhere. It's very important. There's a real possibility for the changes which are happening in Chinese domestic economy to have a positive impact
Yeah.
in
Dr.
Africa.
Gao, this is a very interesting and fresh case study Ms. Ryder helped us to do, which is when a trade war happens between the two largest economies in the world, what does it mean to the other economies, like to a small developing economy as in the African continent? What do you say about that? And therefore, what does that mean for China to work with these African economies, to work with the African entrepreneurs?
Well, first of all, the so-called trade war is not initiated by China. It's unilaterally launched by the United States against countries like China and many other countries. Secondly, China does not want to have a trade war with the United States, but once the United States launches a trade war, China will need to retaliate.
Right.
And no one in the world should expect that you can bully China and China will kowtow to you.
Having said that, though, what does that mean for the other economies working with China?
For the African countries in particular, I hope the choice will be very clear. Continuing supporting the globalization, promoting free trade, continue with the reform of the market, and welcome foreign direct investment, and participate as an equal partner to all these trading deals. And I think China can really share our experiences and lessons we have learned for the past 40 years, so long as you maintain stability and so long as you keep working hard.
And an
the
independent
future
decision-making process
exactly.
within the country itself, not
the
being
future will be brighter.
interfered by the others. Mr. Gupta, what do you make of this very interesting case study suggested by Ms. Ryder earlier?
Oh, I think China's role in Africa has been very, very beneficial. You know, at this point of time, there's this big conversation of the Belt and Road Initiative and whether the Belt and Road Initiative is trapping countries in debt or it's a foundation for them to grow and get rich and prosperous. The fact of the matter is that long before Belt and Road Initiative was announced, China was already a big capital exporter and investor in Africa. That was mostly in the resources sector, where governance, African governance, was very poor. In spite of that, there is the widespread consensus that it has been to the benefit of both sides. Thereupon now, what China is doing in Africa is basically trying to help Africa grow its own industrialization model. So China is not so much into the resource angle there as much as it is in terms of developing special economic zones which can provide the foundation for labor-intensive growth the way China grew in the 1980s. So from that perspective, China has been very useful, and it is important, therefore, that both African countries, China, and other developing countries deepen their commitment to globalization and also begin to use multilateral tools, or at least endow the multilateral system with tools which allow more stable environment for investment relations, so that these countries can all grow in a mutually win-win perspective.
But I'm not sure, Mr. Gupta, your view is being echoed by your president at all in Washington. Having said that, though, many believe that China's presence in Africa is a push for key infrastructures on the continent. For example, the Madaraka Express connecting the Kenya port of Mombasa with Nairobi was opened last year. The railway is being extended northwest Kenya, and there are plans to extend it even further. The Madaraka Express has cut travel time between Kenya's two most important cities from 12 hours to 4.5 hours rather. The railway is also spurring business around the stations with the real estate development, commercial and industrial parks, and tourism. These, in turn, are creating more jobs for the economy in Kenya. Of course, I understand that, Mr. Ryder, you originally were from Kenya. So you see that example. I'm not saying 100% perfect, the example that I just raised, but rather it is one of those case studies that people could put their eyes on and understand what exactly has been done. But Ms. Ryder, some were saying, well, maybe, you know, Kenyans do not need necessarily only 4.5 hours travel time from one city to another. They can just afford 12 hours. And therefore, there's no need to build a railway like that in Africa. you heard voices like that a lot.
Sure.
They would say, this is not economically viable, there are not many passengers, the Africans do not necessarily need that fast train. What would you say?
Well, the business case isn't proved yet, because actually that train needs to be going also through Uganda and Rwanda, which was the original plan, and hopefully that will continue, that plan will be stuck to. And so we also need the industrial zones to develop around the area, so that really what this train is not, it's not just to enable passengers. Don't get me wrong, passengers are really having a great benefit from it. Trying to get onto that train is really difficult. It's very busy all the time. There's only 2 every day, even though it's just 4.5 hours. But you know, you still need to try and book it well in advance. The key, actually, to making that train helpful for the economy is moving industrial goods. So it's not just about the train itself, it's also about Kenya's industrialization path, also the industrialization path of East Africa as a whole. And so it will take years before we see the real results and the real impact of this train. But nevertheless, it has been helpful for the economy already, even though, yes, Kenya is in a challenging debt situation initially at the moment. But that was always to be expected. It's kind of like taking a loan in order to start a new business. If you're always going to have a difficulty at the beginning.
Right.
But
well,
if you have a good business model, it will go forward.
That is one of the things we mentioned, which is in developing countries, such as on the African continent, China working with the countries and companies on the continent. And the other thing, for example, in the Pacific region, many of the Pacific island countries also have been receiving China's aid. Some of China's aid has much exceeded some of the traditional donors in the region. Earlier was Australia, the United States, and Japan, but China's aid could be 10 times more over just the past few years than the original one. So some of those original traditional donors became suspicious about exactly what China wants to do, whether China wants to root them out of the region. Dr. Gao, this is in a way different compared to the African case studies. But on the other hand, there's certain logic there. That is, people see China try to work on a very good relationship with these developing countries. And they get nervous. They're afraid that their foundation, their base, going to be gone. Therefore, for China, it's not just the issue of trade war. It is only part of the picture. It's an overall suspicion about China, about what it wants to do.
Well, I think, yes, indeed, there are many countries in the developed world which are suspicious of the real strategic intention of China when it reaches out to many countries in the world. When we talk about Pacific Island countries, for example, the real fact is that many of these countries have been long neglected. There is a lack of infrastructure, and especially when mankind is faced with this prospect of rising sea level,
That's right.
and many of these very low-lying island countries may be inundated. Therefore, there is an urgency to help them to build up infrastructure and to help them to come up with alternative plans just in case, for example, less and less land will be available and more crowded the population will be. Therefore, if any other country, including New Zealand or Australia or Japan or the United States and Canada, for example, are really interested in the real situation on the ground, then come up with more plans to make investments in these island countries. Don't blame China for being more proactive in helping these countries. And I hope the taste of the pudding is really in eating it. Talk to the island countries' people and see whether they really want to have more infrastructure being built up.
Right.
I believe they want to have these infrastructures. They want to have the ease of the mind, not only in peaceful time, but just in case when crisis hits.
That's right. Mr. Gupta, though, does it really matter what the Chinese say? I mean, even though Dr. Gao and also Ms. Ryder have been very articulating about their own case studies and their arguments, do you think really Washington cares? On the one hand, it says, well, we're suspicious of China. We don't know what China is thinking. On the other hand, when China expresses itself, explains itself, Washington would just brush it off and say, well, maybe it's not telling the truth. So does it really matter whether China explains or not? When you see a country already becoming, quote-unquote, your rival, whatever that country does, become evidence of why that country should be the enemy. Is it?
No, I understand the point. I think there is a basic pro forma necessity to try to be as transparent and just communicate your intentions. But at the end of the day, as Victor just said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And one will see what has been done or what has not been done. And we have already had that proof of the pudding in the eating with regard to the African continent in many respects. When China went into Africa in the resources area in the early 2000s, the talk was all about neocolonialism, etc., etc. That talk has really dimmed down, because right now, if you speak to an African, they will tell you how appreciative they are, by and large, about Chinese investments. And that's why I believe even with Belt and Road, in the initial stages, there's bound to be a lot of suspicion. But at the end of the day, it will be the projects which and their contributions to that domestic society and that economy, which will be the basis on which China will be judged.
Well, Mr. Gupta, I'm not sure whether you read news recently, but certainly that kind of accusation has not died down, as you earlier suggested. Therefore, I go to Ms. Ryder. We only have 1 minute left, ma'am. But your thought about this?
I think China can do a lot more to help African countries and others feel more comfortable. Bring out another foreign aid white paper. The last one was in 2014 and didn't break down foreign aid by country. We could have another one. That would be very helpful. It would allay concerns. It would help people understand what China's doing in different countries. Show China's ready to talk.
As simple as that?
Yes.
All right.
Several steps.
There we go. We got some result today. Discussion. Thank you so much, Gao Zhikai, Hannah Ryder, and Surya Gupta. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.